So In a Violent Nature was directed by Chris Nash, and it's about this killer who's loose in the woods and such, and he begins killing various people in the woods, particularly a group of, school kids who are out in the woods for whatever reason. And this movie is interesting in that instead of being from the perspective of like people who are being killed and such, it's actually from the perspective of the killer himself. So this is a movie that I've been hearing about for a little bit. I was kind of intrigued because of the aspect that they were doing with this movie. It's like, oh, instead of it being from the aspect of the heroes and such, like people who are being stalked and killed and such, it's actually going to be from the perspective of the killer. So I was kind of curious to see how that was going to play out. And I was definitely curious because the reception to this seems very divisive. Some people absolutely love this movie, some people absolutely hate this movie. And also I also read somewhere that someone passed out during a screening. I'm like, okay. I don't usually do well with movies like that, where it's like you hear a lot of people are kind of getting sick while watching a movie, which is one of the reasons I didn't see Terrifier 2. So I still went in despite knowing that. And it's like I wanted to give this movie a chance. And honestly, I can understand some of that reception. It's like I can understand why some people would absolutely love this movie, but I can also understand why some people don't like this movie. It's a movie that I think is both easy to love and also easy to hate. And I won't really commit to either side. But I will be fair and talk about the things I do like in this movie first. First off, I do think some of the kills are pretty creative. They are pretty grotesque at times, very disturbing, gruesome, and just over the top, and they're gross and such. And a lot of times I feel like they use practical effects. It's like, that is pretty impressive practical effects, even though it's gross, and I almost wanted to throw up, but like, I didn't, but it was definitely very creative. And it's like, okay, you're kind of using some of these kills and such to be like to use like practical effects and such. Like, that's pretty creative. Also, there are some kills in this movie that are pretty simple, where it's like you kind of don't really know exactly what's happening, but you kind of like get an idea because like some of these are kind of like homages to some other horror movies. Like some people have compared this to Friday the 13th and such, and some of them they're pretty creative. So it's like you kind of don't really see like what's happening. You kind of only see the aftermath. It's like it's still pretty effective. Also, I do like that there's no music in this movie. Now you do hear some music playing, like some people play it on radios and such, but there's no musical score in this movie whatsoever. And I think that actually helps this movie more than hurts it. I think it helps because it kind of makes it a little bit. I don't want to say it makes it a little bit more realistic, but like it kind of stands apart from the rest of other movies out there. And I feel like music in like some of these scenes where it's like people are being killed and such, I feel like the music would just get incredibly loud and such, and maybe overpowering like some of these like death scenes and such. But here it kind of makes you think, it's like, where are they going to go next? Like, what's going to happen next? Is this going to stop? Is this going to keep going? Is this going to get even more disturbing and such? And I do think that is pretty effective. Meanwhile, I did think this movie was incredibly well shot. Yeah, granted, there's a lot of walking in the woods and such, but I do think that it does kind of like mimic some of the 80s style of movies, like, 80s horror movies and such, like Friday the 13th, like Halloween, Evil Dead, Nightmare on Elm Street a bit. So it's clear that Chris Nash kind of took a lot of lessons from those movies. It's like kind of like how those movies were kind of presented and such. So I do think that's very fascinating. And also there are some long takes in this movie that are pretty incredible. I'm a sucker for long takes in movies, and it kind of reminded me of a horror movie I kind of wanted to do where a lot of it was in one take, but I kind of dropped that because I didn't know where to go with that. But it kind of reminded me of that a bit. And also, there are some really funny moments. Yeah, this movie's pretty dark, but there are some moments where I was watching this movie and I was kind of laughing and such. Like, there's one scene after the killer kills someone and he looks at a necklace and such and kind of realizes that's not what he's looking for and such. It's kind of funny, but it's definitely one of those movies where it's like, it doesn't use humor a lot, but when it does, it's effective. But let's talk about what I don't like in this movie, and that is the story itself is just incredibly generic. Now, I can understand like why maybe they didn't want to do like an in-depth story or anything, because like this movie is it's just basically Friday the 13th, but it's just from someone else's perspective. So I kind of understand parts of it where it's like the story doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, or the story is pretty much non-existent at times, but it's still kind of boring at times. I don't want to say it's boring, but like it's just kind of disturbing at times, because like you're kind of watching at times is just these people kind of get slaughtered and such. I'm like, well, that's not fun. It's just kind of boring. It's like there's really not much of a story going on. It's like, oh well. Also, some of these characters are just incredibly written and such, incredibly thinly written. They are some of the worst characters out there, and the movie does a good job of making me unsympathetic towards these characters a bit. Like, one of the teens says a few things that are just absolutely awful, and like, oh, I can't wait for you to die, honestly. But some of these characters do incredibly dumb things. I mean, dumber than most other horror characters would do. Um, Towards the end of the movie, one of the characters tries to distract the killer, and it's the dumbest thing you could do. It's literally the dumbest thing you could do. I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? I did not care for him. And also, the movie does try to have like a final girl, because like, a lot of these horror movies try to have a final girl and such. But I couldn't care because like the movie doesn't, again, because of the way it's told, it's from the perspective of the serial killer and such. I really couldn't care for this other character because like we don't really know too much about them. Like, what was their deal? Like, why are they really connected in this? Like, why were they the survivor and such? Because they were the smartest person? Okay, that's fine enough, but still don't really care too much. Ironically, the killer, who doesn't really say anything, gets a lot more development than some of these characters who are allowed to speak. That's fascinating to me. And also, there are parts of the ending I don't really like, mainly because at that point it's no longer from the perspective of the killer. It kind of feels like it kind of like destroys a lot of the movie that I was trying to go for. It's like kind of like a few random scenes to kind of tie it all up, but to me it just didn't work because it kind of like broke away from that whole thing. Like, it broke away from the whole perspective. Like, how like some movies that are kind of like presented in long takes, they kind of like go through it for the entire movie. Like, imagine if they kind of like just stopped doing that randomly. Like, imagine if 1917 stopped doing the long take for like 5 minutes. It just kind of feels weird. Or if Birdman, if like at the ending scene, it's like it still had like those like clips that were like intercut with each other. It was that for 5 minutes. It'd be kind of weird, and that's kind of this movie because like it kind of like breaks away from what it was trying to do for the last like 10 minutes of this movie. Again, when you kind of see this movie, you'll kind of understand it a little bit, and I kind of am trying to be a little vague about this movie for that reason. But there are definitely times where I was watching this movie and I thought, I can understand why people thought this movie was pretty good or pretty intense or intimidating and such. But I can also understand why some people would watch it and think, this movie's not particularly great, it's just somewhere in the middle, it's just not for me. Even though there are some creative kills, the use of music's pretty fascinating. The cinematography is at least good, and there are some pretty funny moments, even though the subject matter is pretty dark. And surprisingly, the killer gets a lot more development than some of the other characters and such. The story's just very thin. The characters themselves are very thin. The ending, I was just not impressed by. It was a movie that, again, I can understand every reaction to it. I'll give In a Violent Nature 2 out of 4 stars. Stream it. So, what was the last horror movie that you just felt mixed on? Like, you didn't love it, you didn't hate it, you were just there. What do you think? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.